Let's bring in Mike Hanna in Washington, D.C., who's covering this NATO summit for us. A great deal of focus on Ukraine, with NATO leaders vowing an additional 40 billion euros in aid to Ukraine over the next year, Mike.
Yes, indeed. Well, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had been on social media saying that what was critical for his country was air defense systems with the ongoing Russian offensive. And he got his wish. A number of countries have pledged to provide Ukraine with strategic air systems. The US, Romania and Germany are providing Ukraine with 4 Patriot missile systems, which was an item that Zelensky specifically asked for. So that is going to Ukraine, the exact time period not known, along with F-16 fighter jets that have been pledged by other NATO members. So certainly from Ukraine's point of view, this has been a successful summit. However, the one issue still outstanding, membership of NATO. Ukraine wants to be a member. It is not clear when that will happen.
Yeah, and one of the major concerns also at this NATO summit, even if it's not being said publicly, Mike, is who will lead the U.S. after the November election, and President Biden's presidency and his campaign still under a great deal of scrutiny there.
Well, on his way to the summit, President Biden stopped off for a speech to union members at which he made very clear his intent to contest the election. He's repeatedly said that he will not stand down from the candidacy despite the ongoing criticism, some from within his own party. Another voice has been added to that in the course of the day. That's from George Clooney. This is not just a Hollywood actor thing. He is the biggest fundraiser for the Democrats, and he has called on what he calls his friend to step down for the good of the Democratic Party. It's a voice that could be very influential. Within NATO, it's a major concern because they need to know who is going to be leading the US after the November elections. It's a matter not on the agenda, but is something that is being discussed privately intensely.
Thank you very much for that, Mike Hanna, reporting there live from Washington, D.C. Well, Russia has been watching the NATO summit closely. Yulia Shapovalova has more on that from Moscow.
According to Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Rudenko, Moscow is not expecting anything from the NATO summit in Washington. All the alliance's decisions will only be aimed at escalating the Ukrainian crisis. Russia follows the news and reports coming from the West and NATO. Among the latest, the United States is going to deploy long-range weapons into Germany in 2026. No doubt the reaction will follow. British Prime Minister's words about Ukraine's right to use British Storm Shadow missiles to potentially strike Russia's territory were called irresponsible by Kremlin spokesperson. The news that a number of NATO countries are starting supplying Ukraine with the F-16 fighter jets received a very negative reaction too. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said that that was evidence that Washington was leading a war gang. The country's leadership here assures the population that Russia is fighting NATO in Ukraine, as NATO is Russia's real enemy. So all that gives Russia a reason to boost its military-industrial complex and continue its military operation in Ukraine, trying to bring this country under its control with no end in sight. Yulia Shapovalova, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
And NATO is funded by direct and indirect contributions from its members. It has 3 main budgets: a military budget, another for infrastructure and training, and a third that covers the costs of the headquarters and civilian staff. In 2006, members agreed to commit a minimum of 2% of their GDP to defense spending. This year, 23 allies will meet or exceed this target compared to just 3 in 2014. The U.S. finances nearly 16% of NATO's annual budget of $3.5 billion. Across Europe and Canada, allies are stepping up defense spending this year by 18%, the biggest increase in decades. Well, let's speak to Michael Ryan about all this. He's a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO Policy and is joining us from Washington, D.C. Very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. NATO leaders in Washington very keen to project unity and strength. But how strong is the alliance today?
Well, thank you, Folly. Thank you for having me on board. It's a great question. The alliance is stronger than ever, The details of the budget increases that you just outlined are very important, but they're not the whole story. NATO now, for the first time, has 500,000 troops on high readiness. That means they're ready to go at a moment's notice, and that's a great increase since the end of the Cold War. We also have alliance unity, not just amongst the members, but with the Asia-Pacific partners who are attending their third summit in a row, alongside members of the European Union leadership. And so it really is coming together as a transatlantic community with a single focus, and that is to support Ukraine, to stop Russia, and to ensure that the alliance continues for another 75 years.
What challenges does it face? What's the biggest challenge it faces today?
As always, NATO is an alliance now of 32 members that decides by consensus. So maintaining consensus, maintaining solidarity is always the most difficult challenge, because big problems come up from time to time, and it takes a while through consultations at NATO to develop a shared perspective on what to do about them. In recent years, we saw an end to arms control treaties with the Russians because the Russians were violating those treaties. That took a while to get all allies together. And so while it may seem that there's disunity in the alliance really manages a process of bringing allies together to a consensus vote based on a shared perspective of the challenge and the best way forward. All allies are committed to the fact that the best way forward is together.
Right. Now, they've pledged in Washington, they're expected to pledge an irreversible commitment to Ukraine's membership. There's been a great deal of focus on Ukraine. Will Europe and the U.S. be safer with Ukraine in NATO?
Yes, I believe they will. Recall that in 2008 at the NATO summit, Ukraine was offered membership but no timetable, along with Georgia. The reason is, and we see this in President Putin's behavior, Ukraine, firmly embedded in the Western way of life, if you will, is the surest end to Russia's imperial designs against its neighbors. We all know that President Putin has said he wants to restore the Soviet Empire. Well, if he can't get Ukraine, then he can't get the rest of it. So it's safer for Central Asia, safer for the Baltics, and safer for all of Russia's neighbors. So really, having Ukraine with its potential, which is not just military potential, but its agricultural resource potential, will enhance not only the alliance, but also the European Union.
But as we heard from our correspondent in Moscow, this is not going to go down well with the Russians. How might NATO respond if there was to be some sort of action or reaction from the Russians?
Well, it's a fair question. Nothing seems to go down well with the Russians. They've staked their entire future on victory in Ukraine. And remember, they started the war. It was unprovoked. It's a full-scale invasion of a sovereign nation. And any response that Ukraine's allies provide is looked unfavorably by Moscow. Remember, the target audience of what Moscow is saying is not NATO. It's not Europe. It's not the United States and Canada. It is the global South, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, the nations of Africa and South America, who are deciding which way they need to go in the world for their own futures. And so we have to take everything Moscow says with a grain of salt.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the future of the alliance, Michael. There's a lot of worry right now about the future of NATO, even if the leaders in Washington are not expressing this publicly, concerns about the prospects of another Trump presidency. What would that mean for the future of NATO?
Well, predictions about the future are hard, but when we look to the past, we see that NATO has faced existential crises every few years where everyone said it was the end of NATO, and NATO is still here and stronger than ever. President Trump has already been president. He's the one who raised higher than any other president had ever done the specter of not enough burden sharing by the Europeans, but every president before him had done the same thing. He actually increased U.S. military spending in Europe. He repostured our troops to be in a better position to defend against Russia. He was the first one to authorize lethal assistance to the Ukrainians. And so his criticism is of the nations of NATO who aren't spending enough, not of NATO itself. NATO is definitely in the U.S. Security interest. There's broad bipartisan support for it, and so it will continue.
Okay. Thank you so much for talking to us, Michael. Michael Ryan, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO Policy, live there from Washington.